giving you my impression that there's nothing more stale than an old translation. Because usually a translation is intended to supersede a previous version. And in that it's very different from an original text, which is meant to be preserved as is. So when you're a creative writer, you create a work that is meant to be finished, whereas when you're a translator, you set out to create another version with the knowledge that this may not last and there may be another version to come. So translation is a very temporary art form. Okay? So in this talk, I want to demonstrate the impermanence of language as it relates to our own human impermanent bodies. And I will first look at the Argentinian writer Borges' philosophical short story, The Library of Babel. And then I will turn to an example of my own work and process to illustrate my point. So first, before we get to Borges, the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, which you're probably familiar with, but I just wanted to refresh everyone's memory. The humans are saying, let us make ourselves a name so that we are not be scattered over the face of the earth. So they built this tower to give permanence to the name. But then God intervenes by creating the confusion of languages. The architects stop building the tower, and this then becomes a symbol of incompletion. The tower is left abandoned in ruins, and people are scattered over the face of the earth in different languages. The story to me is intriguing because it connects these two diametrically opposed media. Language, which is forever changing and has a slippage of meaning, and architecture, which is at least intended, usually approached with the intent of building something that's lasting, an edifice out of rock. Right? So David Spur in Architecture and Modern Literature writes, and I quote, "This abandonment of the towers shatters the dream of permanent meaning that would be symbolized by the translation of language into brick." And I was kind of struck by this phrase, the translation of language into brick. And I want to go with this metaphor because if translation of language into brick is not possible, as we've seen, I would like to suggest that perhaps the location that makes translation possible is the human body of the translator. Now that sounds funny, a human body is not a geographical location in the architectural sense, but writing and translation are always embodied in the sense that they pass through somebody's person, right? If linguistics confusion is the state of mortals, of humans, right? They're being expelled, God comes in and separates himself from the humans. And they are connected to the organic state of living and dying and disappearing and being impermanent. Then we can anchor language in the human through translation. So it's impossible to translate language into brick, but it's possible to anchor it in our bodies. So now I want to turn to Borges' universal library in the story The Library of Babel, which is a kind of a futuristic story. So I've just told you about this ancient biblical tale. And now we have an imaginary architectural construct which is in itself infinite, and if you go on the internet you can see some pretty interesting architectural renderings of that library. And it houses an infinite number of incomprehensible books. There's a first-person narrator who speaks of finding those books impenetrable and then therefore useless. So he tells of the numerous scholars who have become violent or depressed or suicidal, all in the attempt to understand the contents of the library. And he himself experiences the frustration of, quote, the formless and chaotic nature of almost all books. And he compares his search for understanding to, quote, looking for meaning in dreams or in the chaotic lines of one's hands, end of quote. And then he says, however, to me it does not seem unlikely that on some shelf of the universe there lies a total book. He searches for this meaning in the hope that, quote, if an eternal voyager were to traverse the library in any direction, he would find after many centuries that the same volumes are repeated in the same disorder, which repeated could constitute an order, and that is order itself. So this is very futuristic, because he then also mentions that humans are on the road to extinction, so this Voyager would travel and humans would be long dead when this order is discovered. And at the same time, he clings to this possibility that such an order does exist, and thereby prove that the books are not nonsensical. And he calls that his elegant hope, and that's the end of the story. So you could call this story utopian or dystopian, but it's kind of a futuristic story. And one of the books I wanted to give here as an example is the letters MCV. Okay, the book is composed of these 3 letters perversely repeated from the first line to the last. So that's one of the books in the library. And the narrator realizes that, quote, 410 pages of unvarying MCVs do not correspond to any language. And then he explains that some librarians insinuated that each of the letters could influence the next, and so the value of MCV on the 3rd line of page 71 isn't the same as that of the same series in another position on another page, so they have this argument. But then he also says this thesis did not prosper, so there's nonsense. Now, a colleague of mine, an artist, actually produced a book. The book is out now. He spoke here on campus in October, and there was a performance in Strasbourg in December. He created this book of 410 pages of unvarying MCVs. It was designed as a blueprint for the performance, where people come together looking at the book, speaking those letters in their own language. And the result was, or would be, anytime you do this performance, that the same 3 letters will sound different, and that there's never ever any repetition, simply because the letters give you an order, but each moment when a person actually speaks and utters the letters with their own particular accent, and even if it's the same person, it differs from moment to moment because it goes through time. So this illustrates that meaning is generated differently at each moment in time, and that the people who speak this letter are always in the present, right? Physically enunciating, and that humans then invest this meaningless book of MCVs with meaning as they speak. So it becomes then a matter of presence. So the conclusion that I would be drawing from that in regard to translation is that the abandoned Tower of Babel, with the resulting confusion of language, relegates knowledge to the bodies of humans, and Borges' nonsense text is meaningful when it is spoken by living, breathing individuals. I see translation as an affirmation of this particular version of humanity in its finitude and impermanence and limitation, because the sharpened consciousness of the translator as someone who creates texts that may be obsolete and will by definition not last, is the consciousness of one's own physical and finite presence in the universe. Translation is to freeze time and arrest the multitude of possibilities as you make your choice which word to translate into, but paradoxically knowing that the fixity of that moment will also not last. The translator knows how we think about a given text or word from each moment to the next is always accompanied by the agony of knowing that it could also be different. So it is to trust one's mortal body as a location from where meaning is generated, with the sounds one hears, images one sees, the memories of things associated with words that one is intimately familiar with, that provide tools for the translator to draw on. And this is how we, as translators, create meaning in the knowledge that it can change the next moment, and that makes it also come alive. So that was my part on the philosophy. Now I just wanted to share with you the work in progress of a short story, and this is only the opening, so I have more of the English handout than the German. The people who read German, well, maybe enough for everyone, but this is the original, so take one of each if there's enough. And then we have time for questions, I'm sure. But I wanted to make sure I debated on whether to read the original because not everybody knows German, but then I thought the sound of it might be helpful. And we'll just do a very brief, this is more now like a class actually, so we'll do a very brief initial German and then the 3 versions. And the way I usually work the process when I teach translation or when I translate is I have a literal version that's really mechanical, very literal. Then I have a second version that completely departs from the literal one, and then I have a final version which is a synthesis and where, you know, I would rein myself in, not taking too much license, but also making sure that it sounds good in the new English version. So you can see and you can hear that what I may have been struggling with the most is whether to make it sound more German and more American. And my view of things is that you should preserve the traces of the original and not make it sound as if it were written in the in the English, because then that erases that trace. So that was my concern, and I also had a number of things about temporality, switching "one day it came to pass" versus "once upon a time," which sounds much more ancient, like a fairy tale. You will see. So let me just read the German one, and I just read the first sentence. Okay. Eines Tages ging ein Mann durch die Häuser der Stadt, in denen Kinder wohnten, wie er sagte, ihren gesundheitlichen Zustand zu prüfen, und er verschaffte sich mit seinem höflichen und zuvorkommenden Gebaren bei den Müttern den Eintritt in die Spielzimmer. So this is one sentence, because I had to make it 2 in English. So the literal version is, one day it came to pass that a man visited all the buildings in which children were living in order to supposedly examine their health, and with his polite and courteous demeanor he was able to gain the permission of the mothers to enter the playrooms. This sounds kind of clunky, I think. So then the second one was, once upon a time a stranger visited all buildings in which children lived and claimed that he was in charge of examining their health. With his polite attitude and respectful demeanor, he was able to gain permission from the mothers to enter the playrooms. This sounds very fluent, right? But it does go away a lot from that ominous tone. And I should say something about the text. Is a short story. It's kind of a science fiction from the 1950s, was published in a newspaper. It's a children's story, and it's very post-war. I can say more about it as we come to the question time, if you like. But so the final one I tried to, and this isn't finished, but to keep that sort of Germanic, complicated explanation, but also make it less clunky. So I have, one day it came to pass that a stranger, claiming to be a health inspector, gained entry to all the homes in which children lived. His courteous and respectful demeanor put mothers at ease, and they granted him permission to enter their nursery. So it's a little more formal, but it's not, you know, the first one really is very literal. I don't know, do you want to hear the second part of that? Okay, so let me see, where do I have here? Lassen Sie mich einige Minuten in Ruhe den Kindern beim Spielen zusehen, bat er. Die Freude an der Jugend strahlte ihm aus den milden Augen, aus dem warmen Lächeln, das er zur Schau trug. Die Mütter hatten sogleich großes Zutrauen zu ihm, zumal er sich so ausgezeichnet mit einem dienstlich gesiegelten Schreiben des staatlichen Gesundheitsministeriums ausgewiesen hatte und somit der Verdacht, dass es sich um einen Einbrecher oder Kindermörder handeln könnte, von vornherein ausfiel. It's actually very funny, and this is another part. It's sort of yeah, it's again a long sentence, but so first he's starting, just let me watch the children and play quietly for a few minutes, he said. So that's the literal, and I then changed it later into, could I watch the children? Because I think Americans always ask, could I please, would you mind? They're much more polite, and Germans always say, I want this, give me that. So I changed it into a question. And then, pleasure and the joy of youth shone from his mild eyes and the warm smile with which he presented himself. Now, grammatically, this really doesn't work well, so I have pleasure and the joy of youth shone from his gentle eyes and from the well, I guess I left it. Did I? Yeah, his gentle eyes and warm smile expressed a joyful attitude towards young people. And it sounds a little like pontificating the young people. So I thought that would better. But it's not finished. And then that sentence, I love this because it goes from the mothers trusted him. And then it's good that he's not a child killer, right? It's actually very funny. It goes, immediately the mothers trusted him, especially since he had identified himself so properly with an official letter from the government's Department of Health, whereby the suspicion that he might be a burglar or a child murderer was instantly eliminated. So that's kind of the literal, and I don't know how to make it even more like absurd in a way. So the second one was immediately the mothers trusted him, especially when he identified himself so properly with an official letter from the government's Department of Health, which instantly eliminated the suspicion of him being a burglar or child murderer. So this instantly eliminates the suspicion. I thought was better than the whereby the suspicion was eliminated. That I don't know. Okay, so and then the third one was mothers instantly trusted him, especially after he produced a letter from it should be health department probably, which immediately eliminated any suspicion of him being a burglar or child molester. And I somehow thought that in the German cultural context, Kindermörder is used like Americans would use child molester, and so I took that poetic license, but again, it's still in progress. And if you have, thoughts and ideas, I've actually translated the whole thing, but I brought in only this memo. So it's about 10 pages long, and who knows whether it'll see the light of day, but it is interesting work because of the tone, So that would be the end of my formal talk, but I will be happy to take questions on also the first part.
Thank you. Help me thank the formal tone. And by all means, Q&A, questions, responses. I thought that was really interesting, like translating more by tone than that specific reference of murderer. Because tonally, you're right. I mean, in American culture, more than ever, it's like molester. It's just all that, the buzz around it. I'm curious.
Although I think many of the readers of this would have seen M. The Peter Lorre Fritz Lang movie, and so child murder.
Oh, interesting.
Child murder, we can't associate it with German.
Yeah, and all literature from the 50s in Germany reads like out of date because you have World War II in between, so you have this sort of Weimar culture still, the language of that still pervades text. But then it's also very Cold War, very post-war American science fiction. I think they're building this huge toy, and there's some, the man who's looming, entering the playrooms, it becomes very disturbing. So.
And it came to pass, I like, because it's biblical, or mock biblical.
Yeah, right. The sanctimonious tone somehow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So do you have I see here you've made the adjustments or are still experimenting with adjustments in terms of like the child molester versus child murderer, but do you have a tendency to prefer to maybe stay closer to the text and talk about things maybe in your introduction? Like do you when you're translating, do you anticipate how much you'll be able to introduce it, or how much like do you have like a footnoting preference? Or you like, I know some people are for or against.
It's completely, and this maybe relates to the previous segment of the talk, it's completely different from when I write something. It's not an intellectual task, it's more like listening, being in the text, and hearing it. I have no idea how it comes out. And I mean, that's why I have to rein myself in. I mean, the second version is usually like way too far from the original. But I found this, having said this, when I teach, that the students are too afraid to go away from the original, and that I always have to push everybody to, please, you can take license as long as you then go back and make sure that it doesn't become your text. So.
I have a question. Sorry, another one just on that. When you talk about the translator as the body where these things pass through, to what extent do you think that when you translate, you should know very intimately the sort of source language? Because I know a lot of people play with translating languages they don't know very well. It can be useful for everyone involved, but sometimes you know, I don't know what's your.
Well, I've been accused. I mean, I'm probably one of the few translators who translate from their native tongue into their acquired language, and I've always felt that that was really a good thing to have, that, you know, to understand the nuances. But yeah, I mean, I may make mistakes in the end, that there are certain things I'd like to have a native speaker read it over. I like to, well, I mean, what was the question was, how close are you? Well, so close, and this is the thing, is because I remember that Onigashun novella, you live with the text, you become that person, you evacuate yourself, and I find this always very painful about translation. I don't know if people in here have the same experience, that you put yourself aside while you're translating, because you need to enter the world of that writer, and it's a humbling task. I mean, you cannot make it your text, right?
Although you kind of do, don't you?
No, I try not to. No,
Willy-nilly?
because if it were my text, I mean, the woman who wrote that novella, she committed suicide. I'm not suicidal, but I tried to get myself into this mode. Like, there's so many variations, but while I was doing it, it becomes very personal. Yeah, you enter the world of that writer, and you try to understand as much as you can of the writer. And when I teach translation, I usually tell people, write a justification that's grounded in the knowledge of, like, do some research on the writer. That was your question, right? How familiar should you be with the context?
Well, even with just the language.
Yeah, well, you should be as familiar as you can. And Gayatri Spivak actually said it's a work of love, is that you love that writer, or that, you know, yeah, that text, I should say. You do everything you can to get to know them as much as you can. And I don't think that prevents someone. You could love, you know, I want to learn Chinese. I'm not very far progressed, and I wouldn't dare translate from it, but just the effort of approaching another language as something that you want to get to know as much as you can.
Can I then make a very general question about your opening? If memory serves, you said that, Caroline, that translations always have to renovate, and that the old ones always seem musty and, you know, kind of outdated.
Yeah.
That wouldn't apply to the King James Bible, I don't think, or.
Well, no, that's an exception. I'm not prepared to say anything about that.
No, I mean, I'm just trying to think.
Bible, but for the most part, texts are transplanted. In one example, I mean, the course that I'm teaching at the Grad Center, and we're reading Günter Grass, and I had taught it before the new translation came out, and a student was like, wait, there's a new translation, and I felt like, oh, I'm old, I have the old translation, I better run out and get the new one, and indeed the new one is a better one. And then I had the old one in my hands, and like, okay, I have to put that in the back of a shelf, nobody wants this anymore.
Yeah.
It really does have that feel to it. Or Proust too. I mean, there were arguments over the new translation, but usually people set out to improve on a translation, right?
But I'm thinking of somebody like Ezra Pound, you know, who in ABC of Reading, he said, okay, if you really want to write, you know, like a proper, you know, see English and translation the way it should be, you should read Arthur Golding's Metamorphosis, which is like 16th century, Gavin Douglas's Warder Scott's version of the Aeneid, and even beyond that we have Florio's Montaigne, which is done at around the same time and was the version that Shakespeare read. So in some cases, I think we do have to.
And there are cases where, like when you teach the Odyssey in our global lit courses, and there's the Lattimore, which is really very literal, and some instructors prefer that, and then there's the Fagles, which is beautiful. Well, when you have what, Phèdre, you have the Hughes translation, which is great, but totally departs from,
Yes.
in a lot of ways from the original, you make your choice what you use to teach and to read. Of course, I was just bringing this up as sort of an inspiration for the talk in relation to Borges's text. Yeah.
So you would argue that when you go about translating something that you know has previous translations, you personally would maybe study those previous translations.
Oh, of course.
And understand the differences.
Absolutely.
You would.
Yeah. And when we teach, I mean, we all in comparative literature, we always teach in translation, but that also means that we need to be familiar which translation do we choose and for what reasons. And so, yeah.
And you do that before you even tried to translate anything on your own. It's not like.
Well, no, that would be different because I think one probably, when I teach it, I usually ask the students to find a writer that hasn't been translated, because you could be totally intimidated by an existing translation, or you could be, I mean, my Unika Zürn text, there's this one by Malcolm Green, and I happen to not think that some of it works very well, but I also don't want to, I mean, he's a fellow translator and I don't want to go around, saying that's a bad translation. So you want to do your own thing and not, I mean, that was interesting actually, because I read the Green translation first. I was like, this guy doesn't understand what this text, I got very emotional about it. And I mean, I respect the fact that he has done his and I have done mine, and so you want to make sure you do your own, right? I mean, you'd be, if you go by everybody else, there'd be even more possibilities. You already have these possibilities in your head that, oh, I have to make these choices, and there are 10 ways that I could do, and then you'd have 20 ways you could do it. It's too much.
So when you say that you translate to improve upon a text, what do you mean by, is it maybe because you've heard that the other translation isn't that good, or maybe you've...
Well, usually I would think teaching that something could use improvement, like in Thomas Mann, where we talked about the Lower Porter as opposed to the Neugroschel, I think, and so I'm teaching the Neugroschel.
John Woods, I think, did the Mann. Which
He did, that's a different translation.
Oh,
That's a different one.
Yeah.
Okay, well, great writers usually, I mean, canonical big writers have several translations, and you would see the weaknesses at certain points, and they could be like something is in the 50s, everybody's very prudish, and there's a sexual scene, and they're sort of beating around the bush, and you think, come on, let's retranslate this, what is being said here. That was incidentally, I think, with the Grass, because Grass is very bawdy, and so the new translation brings that out much more. The other is sort of coy. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but how do you know that a translation could be improved upon? Because you're familiar with the original and you get familiar with the translation, you see the issues. Yeah, Kinga.
Just because, like, as a reader, we kind of trust the translator. We kind of have no choice but to trust the translator. That it's translated correctly. But are you, just like you said, you had the issue with Green? Are you ever afraid that maybe, like, when you translate your work, you might not get the exact message or the meaning that the original author is trying to basically show us, and that it won't come out the same way?
Of course.
Just because just the language and stuff like that, and even just the ways of the language, it's just sometimes it has a better meaning in the original language than translated, because I know reading in my own language and then reading translated works, I often felt that it was just not, it was translated, correctly, but the meaning just was lost somewhere along the way. So when you're doing that, are you ever afraid that that's going to happen with you?
All the time, yeah.
Really?
It's such a heavy weight, because, well, I mean, that was sort of I was trying to make the point, you live with this constant imperfection and the knowledge that you just can't quite, I mean, the original is there and that's what it is, and there's no way you could ever match that or have the same thing, but what you can do is well, you try your best. I mean, that's it's an approximation, right? And I think translation is a humbling task, because you're always reminded that you're imperfect, or you're not gonna. I mean, the thing is, though, we need the translations, and we can get I mean, those people who say, oh, well, you can't possibly understand this book unless you learn this language, and then nobody learns this language and the book remains unread. I mean, I don't think that's the solution. So I'm so grateful when something is translated. So I thought when I don't know if you felt this way when you translate a writer, that you bringing him or her into the new language, and you can share with all these people who previously had no access to that writer, and that's a positive. That makes you feel like, you know, like a midwife or something, you know, you're bringing forth something. So that makes up for this humiliation.
Muriel Rukeyser, the poet, her analogy for translation was kind of a midwifery, like a midwife of sorts, like delivery is interesting. I think that's apt.
That's why I think people should translate untranslated writers rather than retranslate, just politically speaking, because in this country most of the texts go out, but there's very little coming in, and so the task would be to take a lesser known writer and bring them in rather than do Thomas Mann, Günter Grass. We have enough maybe of those, so I'm contradicting myself here, but the point I was previously making. But I mean, you know, you decide what you want to do.
Yeah.
Do you have people in this program who retranslate, or are they usually?
Oh yeah, it's more. What's great about it now, these savvy young students are all about discovery, which is just fantastic.
Yeah.
But then there's a few, it was really nice, but interesting rediscoveries, like Jonathan Carpinos was doing a really off the beaten path Latin comedy and just restoring, he teaches Latin, and just restoring it in great ways. And there was a Penguin edition that was like so old of this play, and I liked so much better the jokes that he was bringing, you know, and like there was this one where this one speaker in the play was comparing all of these people to certain kind of bread products and baker, and you know, and the student he revivified it so smartly. And then you mentioned too, it's not just meaning a lot of times, it's style, you know, and I think he captured a certain kind of style that the original was kind of flagged in some ways, so it's good. But I told him too, don't get caught up with looking at that old text, like you were saying, like go for it yourself, and maybe we'll look, you know, when you're finished and compare and whatnot. Absolutely. But a lot of new discoveries, right? Yeah.
Whatever you do, as long as it's creative and gives you a feeling of being meaningful.
I have a translators group that we meet once a month and can compare. We're all different kind of languages and traditions. And Barbara Hirschoff, who's at Yale, does a lot of Yiddish and Hebrew. She said her biggest pet peeve is not the fidelity, it's what you mentioned. It's that it's getting students to break open and play, you know, because they want to play it so safe. And a lot of times, weirdly, they miss, you know, they're getting so close that they miss the spirit in some ways, you know. So she has these exercises, she tries to open them up, and, you know, it's curious. But.
I think that's a danger that's often particularly run when you're translating something you love.
That's when you're so close, I think. It's. I mean.
Absolutely.
It's hard to see why it doesn't work the same way, you know?
Right. It's a huge paradox, because you want to be so close to it, and then you have to realize that there is this gap between it and you.
I mean, mentioned to Anne that Merwin, a great poet, I don't know about, I mean, I'm not a Spanish scholar. I know Neruda well enough, and he's really closer to Spanish, and I don't like, I just got his new Copper Canyon put out, a selected of all of Merwin's translations, and he's supposedly this great Spanish guy, and I don't think he gets Neruda, you know, compared to others. But then he's doing some Romanian and Russian, and I think like he's better in some ways, and maybe it's like what Anne's saying, he's so close to the Spanish that I will do it. And I'm just, you know, I know you're brilliant, and I know you're a great poet, but I'm not sure.
I would go for Tarn.
Who is
a great poet and a great anthropologist.
It's curious how that is, though, but
So it's.
But there's also a difference between the process of doing physical research, like in the scene where she's at the swimming pool in Dark Spring. I went to that swimming pool and I lay on those planks, because it says I lay down, I sunbathed, and I did it just to feel what that's like, and so, but that's a physical
like method translation. That's
it's not like that.
Through the body, it's like
right, and then you could have that step into words. So it's
I like that.
different levels. Anyway, so I think
this was really interesting. interesting,
Good.
Mr. Rupprecht. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming.